So hello from Cambridge. I'm Nancy Gibbs. I'm the faculty director of the Shorenstein Center, and I am so glad we could come together to explore innovation in local news. This webinar today is part of a series that we're doing here at Shorenstein on news and media innovation that's made possible by a gift from Elaine Schuster. And we're very lucky particularly to have our fellow Craig Forman leading this initiative. As you all know, through his career steering through old media and new, he's become an industry leader and a wise counselor, and now a pioneer in the search for solutions to some of the challenges that our newsrooms are facing. We'll share with you in the chat the expansive literature review that Craig conducted for us. He has been convening some fascinating panels, and we together have been approaching this challenge in a belief that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to the challenges of the health of our information environment, and particularly the challenges facing local communities in providing access to the information that they need. So it's especially excited that for today he recruited an all-star team of founders, innovators, leaders, and explorers in our media terrain. I think it's important that we understand both the obstacles that entrepreneurs and inventors are facing and the opportunities to reach audiences where they are and provide them the news that they both want and need. So I'm so eager to learn from this group, and I always learn every time I'm on the same Zoom screen with Craig. So please welcome Craig Forman, and he will introduce you to our experts.
Nancy, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and welcome everybody to our really all-star discussion today. It's a great team of leaders, and I won't take a lot of time to introduce each of their biographies. They'll do that as we have our discussion. And we want to also give everybody attending around the world a chance to put their questions in the Q&A. So please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And of course, we'll be in the online chat as well, and we'll try to get to everybody's questions. Let me just take a minute to set up our discussion this way. At Shorenstein at Harvard this year, we featured more than a dozen really great leaders showing us some ways of the digital future for news and information. We have found leaders who are meeting this moment of market dysfunction, crisis in misinformation and disinformation, breakdown of the market model for local newspapers. And all of those topics are very important. But today, what we'd like all of you to leave with are some leadership lessons on this deep dive we're going to go through about meeting the moment in our communities. All of the leaders that we're here with today have been working on the cutting edge of new products and new solutions that are coming up with relevant and essential solutions on digital startup bases to provide news that's essential and relevant for their communities, for their audiences, for their neighbors, and are showing a way forward. We're going to talk about content, distribution, technology, different business models. It's a very tall order to lead with those lessons, but that's our hope, and we have the right team to explore that with. So I'm going to start right away with Candace Fortman, who's with us today from Italy, where she just presented at the journalism conference over there. So hello, Candace, and we're starting with you both because of some technology ups and downs and because it's late there. But I wondered if you could take us through Outlier's story from this perspective. When we think about Outlier Media and we think about Detroit, you guys have actually asked the community, tell us about the news and information that you're not getting that's uniquely relevant here. The founder, Sarah Alvarez, has talked about her community impact studies, how she learned that SMS and text messaging was a more effective product solution than some beautiful, terrific website that people wouldn't access. So walk us through, if you will, the lessons that Outliers learned in Detroit, and maybe even touch on the recent merger in Detroit that's going to make you even bigger there.
Sure. Thank you, everyone. I'm really excited to join you all and to share the story of Outlier with you all. So I think it's important to say that Outlier starts with intention. The most important thing about Outlier's founding is that Sarah started with this intention. And the intention was to figure out how do we better inform communities that have been purposefully ignored or unintentionally ignored by traditional media. And when we think about journalism at Outlier, we're really talking about information more than we're talking about what most people think of as day-to-day journalism. So in Detroit, a city that is 80% Black, 90% POC, and also a city where the majority of people live below the poverty line, how do you best inform people to, one, give them actionable information that they can use to make change in their own lives around the areas of that they have described as the highest information barriers for them? So we first start meeting that challenge by thinking about what information people need to know. And we don't assume that we understand that, right? I am a lifelong Detroiter. I am a Detroiter's Detroiter, but I don't live the same life as every single Detroiter. And so what we do is we survey a group of Detroiters every 6 months. We call that an information needs assessment. And we ask that group of Detroiters over SMS, text message, if you had a reporter working with you over the next week, what information would you have them find out for you? So we're asking them, in what area are you having a problem that you're trying to solve for yourself? We also look at public record information. That includes non-emergency 911 calls and also calls to United Way, which is a community service organization in the States. And we look at what questions people are asking and also what complaints they're making. From there, that is where our beats of reporting find. So every 6 months or so, that means might move as Detroiters' information needs move. You might imagine during COVID, information needs changed dramatically over, especially that first year and second year of COVID. And so from there, we have an SMS text message basis, reported information, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. That service is available in Spanish, Arabic, and English. And so in that system, people can text and say, I have a question about housing. And in there, they'll find a database that allows them to look up a register to see if the person they're paying their rent to, for instance, actually owns the deed to that house. That's an issue that we learned about directly from our SMS service, that there was a large issue with people who were paying rent to folks who didn't actually own the deed to those houses. And so they would find that those houses were ending up in tax foreclosure. And then that meant that they would be kicked out of their homes. You can access information like what food bank is nearest my house. And so the reporters have not just put that information there and built the system and scraped and used data reporting, but they've also checked every phone number. They've checked every link, because we know the people that are coming to us are already in crisis. So we're trying to eliminate the burden that they have so they have good actionable information. We also do accountability and investigative reporting from there, as most people would do. And we do that, most of that work in partnership with larger newsrooms. And then finally, we run a version of CBureau's incredible program, Documenters. So we run Detroit Documentary Partner that trains and pays Detroit residents to go to public meetings, city council meetings, water board meetings, school board meetings, and they take notes at those meetings that are then reporters across the city of Detroit and public record. So we're working to keep a public record of what is happening in our city. The intention of Outlier is to build a different idea of what an audience funnel might be. I don't like the word audience funnel. I think we're really creating a pathway to information. So if you come to us in crisis, we're eventually trying to move you to a place where you're trying to thrive in Detroit, which means that you're able to connect to your neighbors, to our community in a much deeper and richer way, which is why the merger with Detour was so important, because that's a big part of that strategy. Once we get you out of crisis, what do we move you to then that allows you to really deeply engage with the city in a new way?
So just one quick follow-up, Candace, because Madeleine, who will come to next, has actually had to look at a similar question with kind of a very different lens. What's been the single biggest surprising, as a business person, because as the executive director, you're also worried about the P&L and everything else. What's been the biggest surprising kind of key performance indicator or thing that as a lifelong Detroiter, you wouldn't have expected?
That would, I should say, wouldn't have expected. So the SMS service, for instance, I think is the best way to say this. I think that Detroiters, and I am one of these people, have this ability to be really reluctant to try new things. And I think that's for good reason. The SMS service came from an organization they'd not really heard of. We didn't have any ability to market the service. And because of that, what we did, as opposed to having people text in, we bought numbers like a marketing company would, and we texted people out. I always am surprised and also humbled that people trusted this random number, texting them and saying, hey, this is Outlier Media, a free community service. If you need help, use this, program, and they do it. But that also speaks to, I think, the place that people are in where they truly do need help. And they were willing to trust something they had never really heard of. But I think what happens next is what's really beautiful is that, so we text a number and they use the service and it works for them. And so then they send it to their cousin, to their friends, to their neighbors. And they say, hey, when I was trying to figure out what was going on with my house, I use this service. I trust them. You can use it. So this ability to build trust through really, truly grassroots measures in a place where sometimes people can be a little bit reluctant to trust new things, I think is the best indicator that things are working well.
There's a big takeaway there about virality and building trust. So thank you for that. Madeleine, I'm going to come to you now because in the story of El Tímpano, you've had to ask very aligned questions, but in a very different way. So talk to us a little bit about that and how in your experience out here in California, we've got a good California panel today from Cambridge, Massachusetts. How has that gone for you?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'd also just like to extend my thanks for the invitation. It's an honor to be on this panel. And I'd actually say that, my perspective is not very different from Candace's in that, both of our organizations are really seeking to foster a more informed community and particularly to serve communities that have long been left behind by traditional media. And so El Tímpano is Spanish for eardrum, and our mission is to inform, engage, and amplify the voices of Latino and Mayan immigrants. I started El Tímpano nearly 5 years ago now, because for 20 years, Spanish-speaking immigrants have been the fastest growing communities of my hometown of Oakland, which is right behind me, and also of the wider Bay Area, where nearly 1 in 5 residents speak Spanish at home. But you really wouldn't know that by consuming local media, because their voices and their stories are nearly invisible in news coverage and civic conversations. There have been entire podcasts about the housing crisis without one Latino voice. There are health reporters who don't speak Spanish, who have no relationship with or are not aware of the indigenous Mayan community, which has had the highest rates of COVID-19. And so simply imagine the stories that are missed in coverage and civic conversations of the most pressing issues facing our communities. So what really distinguishes El Tímpano and our development is that we really, most news organizations begin with a newsroom and a news product and then work to grow their audience. We really developed in an inverse fashion. So we really first developed an audience or really a community, and spent nearly a year developing relationships with Latino and Mayan immigrants, primarily in East Oakland, and community leaders who serve these communities, who are from these communities, and really listening to their insights and thoughts on what they want to see in Spanish language media. I'll drop a link to the report that we produced at the end of this process. But a few of the key things that we found is, one, simply overwhelmingly the dearth of information. When we asked community members, what would you like to see in Spanish language media? The most common response was simply más información, more information. A lot of people told us that media sparks fear, that the Spanish language media that exists leaves them just feeling like their community is a victim, is being attacked, but without giving them information that they can use to do something about that. People want news they can use. They want actionable information. And finally, we found that in the event of a crisis, there is no central source for timely local news to reach Spanish-speaking immigrants. And we produced this report well before the pandemic. And so, since then, since undertaking this participatory design process, we've developed distribution and engagement and editorial strategies and priorities that are really shaped by what we heard and that continue to be shaped by ongoing conversations with the communities that we serve. So those strategies include in-person engagement, just to be out in the community and meet people where they're at, introduce ourselves and develop a relationship of trust, as well as a text message-based reporting platform, because with Outlier Media, so many community members told us that they don't have a home computer, they don't really use internet, but everyone has a cell phone. So this platform, our SMS platform for local, timely, relevant news and information and participatory reporting, has really become a lifeline to the communities that have been hardest hit by the pandemic. So today, 10% of Oakland's Spanish-speaking households subscribe to our platform, and our audience has really grown to include community members from 9 counties across the Bay Area. So we do kind of see ourselves as civic infrastructure in a way, really connecting community members to the services and opportunities and expertise that they're looking for. So a lot of our work involves developing relationships with city agencies, with community health clinics and legal aid organizations, and providing a connection to community members who are seeking those services and oftentimes lack access to what they're looking for. Finally, we produce in-depth journalism that is powered by this robust community engagement strategy. So, this isn't necessarily what we think of when we talk about service journalism, but we do consider it a service to the audiences that we serve, because community members also told us, we want other people to know about the concerns facing us. We want our issues heard by civic leaders, by voters, by community leaders. And so producing in-depth journalism in collaboration with media partners really achieves the third part of our mission to amplify the voices of Latino and Mayan immigrants. So we've partnered with other local, statewide, and national news organizations to investigate and amplify the stories of the communities that we serve. And a big part of our focus this year is really growing our newsroom to be able to produce more of that.
One of the things that we'll come to later, and Paulette, with whom I'm very happy to serve on the board of American Press Institute, is a board member at Cal Matters. I think that's one of the places, in addition to ProPublica and others, Madeleine, that is offering really interesting new partnerships to explore some of that reporting. But I'm going to do a transition that goes sort of along the following lines. I think you and Candace talked about how you sort of inverted the model, starting with questions and figuring out what information needs were of most, critical importance to the community. Margaret and Jessica, with their backgrounds, had also come from what we might describe as big media. And Margaret, coming to you, and this is a tricky transition because it's really not one that's easy to do, but Jill Abramson, who was famously, I guess the title at that point was executive editor, maybe managing editor, talked about technology being a challenge. Who would pay for the Baghdad Bureau? Well, everyone. Margaret was the Baghdad Bureau of the New York Times, or at least the leader of the Baghdad Bureau, and now is actually figuring out a very different model across a broad geography of Eastern Georgia, including big cities, relatively big cities like Savannah and Brunswick, and smaller cities in between. So geographically, a large space in somewhat contrast to the urban areas of the East Bay or the Detroit area, but at the same time bringing, how would I put it, Margaret, both a sense of what investigations and other sort of impact journalism brings, but also a different outreach into the community, whether it's the Ahmaud Arbery coverage or even your coverage of local government. And so I wonder if you could tell us how you've thought about it, both conceptually knowing what it's like to be a foreign correspondent for the Journal or the Baghdad bureau chief of the New York Times, but now driving a very digital model in Georgia.
unmuting, sorry. Thanks for that introduction, Craig. Yeah, so I grew up a daughter of the South. Both parents were in the military. The military is the family profession. But when I grew up to become a journalist, what I found very quickly is that there are few to no really ambitious journalism jobs in the South. So after a stint at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, I went off to work at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, which I had a fascinating and very enriching career. But basically, I came to a realization at some point after a number of bylines on the front page of both newspapers, these are not my people. These are not the audience that the audience in New York is not who I got into the profession to serve. My problem, though, for very many years was that I needed a paycheck and I wanted to be a journalist, and trying to make Savannah, Georgia, which is where the Current and I am based and talking to you from, making Savannah, Georgia my full-time job was very difficult because of the huge news vacuum that exists in Georgia. Georgia is probably familiar to you as a bellwether state for national politics, but as a state, we are the largest state east of the Mississippi. We also have 159 counties, and we have one of the largest news vacuums of any state in America. When I was abroad and for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, I'd get my Google alerts and I'd get a lot of high school football scores. I'd get a lot of weather reports, and I didn't get a lot of news about the place where I was paying taxes and the place that I called home. And so when I came home full time here to Georgia in 2019, I started having like organic conversations with other people in my friends and family group, and realizing that the news vacuum was real to a lot of different people, not just me who wanted a job, quite frankly. But then we move into a much more serious discussion, because on February 23rd, 2020, Ahmaud Arbery was out for a jog and was murdered. Sorry, it's really it's taken a lot out of me emotionally over the last 2 years, because that's happened in my backyard. And for 74 days after Ahmaud was murdered, nobody knew about it. Neighbors knew about it, of course. His family knew about it, of course, but there was no one who was actually covering the story and holding anybody accountable. And so that typified and was an incredibly tragic example of what news vacuums mean in Georgia. They can actually cost people's lives. And so suddenly this value proposition that I had put forward to a lot of high net worth individuals and community activists and neighbors up and down the coast was we need better journalism, and we need better journalism now. And so that was the simple and very urgent need for launching the Current. And we went through we've gone through a lot of different challenges, not only launching during COVID, not only launching during an incredibly important election year of 2020, but what we realized in terms of building audience, we've had to build audience among people who have no news literacy habits, who cared about news. Georgia is also one of the most civically engaged states in America. 95% of people who are eligible to vote are actually registered to vote in Georgia. And so the question really is, where can they get trustworthy local news instead of national media telling Georgians who Georgians are? And as a slice of that, as the Current, as a startup, we've had to be very intentional about what audiences we're serving and serving immediately as we move through our growth stage. So we have two majority minority towns, Savannah and Brunswick, which is where Ahmaud Arbery lived and died. We have 5 counties in between us who are, one's a majority minority county, the others are rural and have some of the highest poverty rates in the US. And again, there's little to no local news that serve any of these people. And so that's what the Current has tried to do, build audience within this very broad geographic range, but we're all connected along the Georgia coastline. What we've also had to do, though, is build trust in journalism, but also build trust among funders, because as we're all, in the trenches trying to get better information to help sustain and reinforce our American democracy, we've also had to figure out ways in which we can fund ourselves. And part of the Current's origin story has been a really steep curve about who is willing to do that in our part of the country. We went out in our growth, sort of our pre-launch phase, to get seed money together, as any business needs to do. We are a registered nonprofit, but of course, we need a really good business model to function. And there were local families who are incredibly wealthy, who could write checks for us to get us seed money to start and give us a runway to start before the 2020 elections. And they bought in theory. They bought in because we have this value proposition of improving lives and delivering local, nonpartisan watchdog journalism. They also signed our pledge saying that they would remain out of our newsroom and not put any pressure on what kind of news we wanted to publish, in service of all the diverse communities that we have in coastal Georgia. The problem was, literally in our first week that we launched, many of those funders decided that they did want to try to put their thumb on the scale. They did try to want to influence what we published. And we had a pretty strong ultimatum from several of the early donors saying at one point to take down a story, kill a story, or they're going to pull our money. And I will say that, it was a pretty scary moment, because you are all in emotionally, you're all in morally, you're all in ideologically. And suddenly here are people who really aren't in with you. And so an audience of readers and neighbors is one thing, an audience of donors is a whole nother thing. And in our newsroom, it was pretty clear to us, we didn't need them. We didn't need their money, and we were going to try and find a way to survive. So we stood tall. We stayed independent. We lost money, and me and my co-founders have been building sweat equity for a good 9 or 10 months. So it's an origin story that shouldn't be, I think, neglected or ignored as we're talking about audience. One thing that we all have in this large nonprofit ecosystem of new media and local media is that we need to find a way to make this possible year in and year out. Because again, just like diverse audiences that we're trying to serve, we also need diverse journalists in order to serve those audiences better. And that means that people like me who don't come from trust funds need to find a way to get their salaries paid so we can keep going.
Margaret, thank you for that. And thank you for all of that. I think one thing that the debate and the public discussion doesn't often focus on is just the emotional intelligence and the emotional grit and fortitude it requires for all of you to continue to do this day in, day out. And frankly, we also don't talk about the non-alignment of interests of financial owners to being able to stand up for legal expenses that might result in friends being sent to jail. I know we felt some pressures doing the Epstein coverage at McClatchy to not spend the money on the lawyers, but I think that money was some of the money that was best spent in the 160 years of the company. So I'm going to switch to a slightly different conversation, but you'll see the transition here in a second, because Jessica, who's a friend, in addition to everything else, is probably the leading example of someone who has worked at the highest levels of broadcast journalism, also a novelist, but has sort of broken new ground with a direct way of reaching audiences through new media of video directly through Instagram. And Jessica, maybe we can talk about some of the new and up and coming platforms like TikTok or even Snap and how all that works, but with an insight that we need to get back to what is just simply called news, not noise. And you tell the story better than me. So let me throw it over to you if you can sort of take the same approach to what's so radically new about news, not noise in a different medium of, sort of broadcast and video.
Absolutely. I'd first like to say I'm just so impressed by everybody on this panel and so happy to know of the work you're doing, because it makes me feel better about the world and journalism. I spent my career as on-camera correspondent working for the major networks, and finally as the chief White House correspondent for CNN. And I left in part because I felt like I wasn't doing what I got into the field to do. And in 2018, I decided I wanted to provide news in a way that spoke to especially swing and undecided women voters. And my experience as a political correspondent had been that conventional wisdom in Washington was that these women didn't care about politics. That's why they were late deciders or disengaged. But because they were swing voters, I spent all my time as a political reporter in the field interviewing them during the election cycle, and they were enormously engaged. They'd show me their phone and all the articles they were clipping and saving. They just were like, but who's going to improve my healthcare costs? Like, what's the actionable information? And they would always say, I can't listen on TV. It's too noisy. And I feel less informed after I watch. So I thought, how can we provide a product that connects? And couldn't figure out, like, I pitched it to gatekeepers, I pitched it all over, and finally friends were like, just pick up your phone and talk to your phone. And because I was the cheapest talent I could find, I did it. And I started with a video explaining sort of what was going on ahead of the Brett Kavanaugh hearings in Congress, because I'd covered Capitol Hill and I could explain. And I'd started doing these 3-minute breakdowns on Instagram. And it basically was distilled information to an audience that wants information but doesn't trust who's giving it to them. So what's evolved from there is I developed this relationship of trust. I started making these videos. The audience on Instagram grew. I chose Instagram because it was largely female audience, and it was an environment at the time that had not been infected as much with the partisan trickery and the disinformation. And then the audience grew, and I started covering politics there. And I've evolved to have like we have a team now. We're on multiple platforms. We became a place where we combat disinformation, which is extremely challenging on social media because we find that our content is suppressed by the platform. So whereas disinformation travels easily, the fact checks of it don't. And so there are endless barriers. But what this format has provided is a direct connection to the audience that in many ways is a different version of what I hear a lot of you saying, which is you found a way to reach an audience that felt unheard and unseen. And we're able to do that because we're in an environment where they're already getting information. But a lot of our audience has like 3 people they trust on makeup and 2 they trust on cooking, but really they don't know who to trust on news. And so what we do is we sort of vet information for them and direct them to reliable sources. And all day long, we're posting articles from reliable news organizations other than us to drive people to trustworthy sources in the news environment.
Jessica, I wonder if I can throw a question that Gary has put in the Q&A, and Madeleine, thanks for the answer there. But you touched on the issue of misinformation and disinformation, and I wonder if we could just take it a bite or two further, because you have a very personal connection. If you subscribe to News Not Noise, you know, there on any given day, correct me if I'm wrong, but there could be a half a dozen, or even more sort of quick stories. Yeah. But how do you decide that something is going to, you know, you're the news desk, you're the operations director, you're the talent, you've got a lot going on. How do you decide that this is going to be something where you sort of need to attack it head on and try to clear up the misinformation, disinformation cloud?
It's interesting. I mean, I always say the best part of my job is I get to decide what counts as news. And the worst part of my job is I have to decide every day what counts as news. So, right, like we're all in that position when you're the decider. It's a combination of, I see the DMs, like the audience is in constant conversation. So we don't do the texting thing, but because we're on social, we ask people to comment and we look at the DMs, and people reach out in all sorts of ways and tell us what they do and don't know. And oftentimes it's define this word, you know, at the beginning of like, how do sanctions work, right? What is that? We get a lot of, is this true? Can you, and all of a sudden, so I started getting at some point in 2020, why aren't you reporting on all the pedophilia, on all the sex trafficking? And I started seeing that sort of 5 months before people were talking about QAnon, because people are getting that on social media. And so they forward it to me and they're like, is this true? What's happening? And what I always was, so if I get enough of those, I know that this is something I need to be attuned to. We ask the audience questions and and they're very engaged and responsive. And then at some point it's also just, I'm deciding, right? Like, I'm the news director, I'm deciding. I have a team, we, throw things out for discussion. And it's also, having covered politics, if you do it, you have an instinct for what's going to be the story. And so when you see that wave coming, I try to catch it as it's a beginning and try to define the terms and tell people what's coming and help them understand the players, so that when it crests and crashes and it's the story, people already feel read in. I kind of think of this as the last mile. Uber talks about how you can get a lot of places, but who gets you the last mile? We're giving you those tools. You understand the terms, you understand the players. You feel empowered to engage with that story in the future with other news sources.
That's super helpful. And I'd like to come back to a couple of those things, but I'm going to bring in Paulette here as sort of our synthesizer in chief from her kind of unique perspective, because both a digital investor, a digital entrepreneur, and a second generation publisher of one of California's leading publications with a almost now 50, actually this year, right, 50-year tradition of reaching the African-American community principally in Southern California. And Paulette, we've a couple of strands, right? We've talked about the power of distributed computing, and the internet was always to let us hear from more people in real time and have a two-way conversation, among other things. But each one of these successes is actually showing how to tap into that. That's a really different model from where Black Voices started in 1972. So from your standpoint, how do you see a way through this? And also, as a board member of Cal Matters and the Irvine Foundation, you're looking at a lot of different things all the time. Help bring us into some context for us.
Yeah, yes. I wear several hats. So I'm publisher of I'll call it a 50-year-old startup digital operation with the Black Voice News. I'm second generation publisher of that. We're here in the Inland Empire, Southern California. I recently stepped off the board of Cal Matters, but I've been still very connected to folks at Cal Matters, doing some great reporting on state government. And then as a member of American Press Institute board with you, Craig, California Press Foundation. I'm past president of California News Publishers Association that represents all the news publications in the state. And then I work a lot with philanthropy now. So I am on the James Irvine Foundation board, and I chair my community foundation board. And you wonder how I have any time to work on my own operation. But what we're hearing, from this wonderful panel is really what we've seen happening in this kind of digital startup space, at least in California. And we have quite a few California folks here. And that's really what I focus a lot on, a growing number of startups. I think we've done a landscape analysis, and it is not comprehensive at all, but there are about 70 or so digital startups in California. And like you said, like we've heard, there is that conversation with the community that is very different. And I'll share more about our own transformation work that we've been doing and the challenges that we've had. And actually, in some of my work I started an organization called Media in Color. Madeleine is one of our newsrooms that we have the fortune of working with here in California. But we've started it to kind of focus on that transformational work that needs to happen with a lot of legacy publications, especially publications in media outlets that are service communities of color in California. We have quite a few hundreds of those. We have a small group that we've worked with, 15 so far, but there's that kind of constant dialogue with community. There's that kind of practicing that engaged journalism that we're hearing from this panel. People filling gaps in coverage, that's important. And then being very mission driven and often focused really specifically in hyper-local reporting that's being done. And then that measuring impact. Madeleine, I'm so glad she threw her needs assessment in the chat. She is like a great impact report that she presented. Actually, I shared with my team that we need to report on our journalism in the same way, where we're talking about how we're really impacting the community and not just anecdotally. And we're seeing so many different models, right, with nonprofits here as well as for-profits, all working greatly for the public good. I'll just tell my story a little, so trying to now do that. This is like kind of framework or the landscape that we're entering into as the digital publication. We still print. We were started 50 years ago by students at UC Riverside who felt that, like we're hearing with this panel, that their voice was not being heard in their campus paper. And so they started the Black Voice News students, and then they graduated and it ended up in the community. And there were quite a few Black newspapers in our region at the time. And one gentleman in particular, Sam Martin, who kind of had his hand in every single one of, starting every single one of them. He ended up as the steward of the Black Voice News. And my parents were volunteering as their kind of civic engagement work and civic leadership. They were volunteering with his newspaper, the American News, and had the opportunity to then buy very cheaply the Black Voice News from him and take it over. So it became a family business in about 1980. And I grew up doing all aspects of the news business, advertising, layout, design, typesetting, old-fashioned, CompuGraphic machines. Layout. I've done it all. And the biggest challenge I've had, of course, is this transformational work that I'm doing now. Our North Star really hasn't changed. It's always focused on justice-seeking reporting. And we have been doing accountability reporting for the very beginning, kind of reflecting the important stories in our community, but also being that watchdog for local government. And we're continuing to do that work. The challenge for me has been in building a new model while still working in the old. So I'm still printing a newspaper every week. Not a lot, but we still print every week. We're legally adjudicated and have legal advertising. And, we still have in our community people who would like to get the hard copy. So I'm printing and then thinking about and working on digital and what Black Voice News looks like in the digital space. So many things that we've had to do, and I'll try to be brief, in that kind of transformational work. And we're seeing it not just with me, but of course with all the organizations that I'm working with that are trying to do our work with media and color. So, part of it was that community needs, understanding community needs. And Craig, like you mentioned, it was kind of a different mindset. It was like, we know what you want, and then we're going to give you what you want instead of asking what they want. And so that had to be a shift, from our newsroom, actually for all of us, in surveying and really asking our audience what they want us to report on. And then at the same time, having to work internally with our staff on their own understanding of us as an organization, practices. When you talk about innovation, they have to have a growth mindset and not a fixed mindset. So it's like this constantly learning, and it's okay that you're not an expert. And I'm throwing things at them all the time. And it's like, you're not an expert and it's okay. But we're learning. And so as long as we're constantly learning, then it's okay. So getting everyone within the newsroom and on the business side to think differently was part of that challenge. And then the knowing that we needed a new infrastructure. So we went from print advertising, almost 100%, 99% of our revenue was print display ads. And then changing to like a more diverse revenue stream, set of revenue, and trying to build that at the same time. So we were looking at a new CMS. We had to change our workflows. What's the tech that we needed to do that? And then conversations around audience and revenue and product. It's like foreign languages for us, right? So that became another thing that we had to learn in the process. And then I had to find, as the publisher, I had to find the resources to fund it. So, taking advantage of so many opportunities there were in the past 2 years of funding for accelerator programs. Report for America has been an amazing partner in the work that we're doing. We will have 3 full-time reporters this year, working on things like climate. We'll have a full-time photojournalist. And then we have someone who's working on with our data journalism. So we've been taking advantage of every opportunity to get the resources we need. Knight actually funded our purchase or training our staff on Newspack after we transferred to Newspack, and then the money we raised with Media in Color, we were able to help pay offset the cost for Newspack. So we were, so I'm like looking for all kinds of resources, and then at the same time engaging our community differently. So surveying our readers became, a process, something that we had to work into our workflow, understanding the needs, and many of our readers over the years really become like civic leaders, and they're leaders of like Black-led organizations, they're leaders of cities, they're leaders of counties. And then we have our general population, but I think the core of our base are really that kind of civic leaders. So listening to them and hearing what they need. And we'd already started doing some work in mapping and data and finding out that that is something of benefit to them. And COVID hit, we started focusing on COVID data. We ended up with a really robust dashboard on all the COVID data we could find on Black Californians especially. And then the impacts of COVID on our community. One of the statistics we saw, and I don't know if people realize, is 84% of the Black California workforce filed for unemployment benefits in 2020, 84%. And I heard Julie Sue, who was the labor secretary at the time, say that number, and I couldn't believe it, started looking it up. And so that became, that data point became a big question for us. And so we ended up doing some reporting around it, ended up working with the Black Worker Center, once again, being engaged with our audience differently and surveying people to find out what that looked like for them.
And the number was right. It was 84%. And
the number was right. Yeah. There's several articles, written about that. Yeah, it was really surprising. But for many reasons, even though we were frontline and essential workers, we're also heavily like service workers. Things were shutting down. Then you had like care issues. So you had people who had to leave the workforce. You saw what with women, especially, to take care of children or parents. And so that number was a real number, and we're still doing some reporting. We have our data journalists doing some reporting around that. So for us, we know information is really what helps the community act. We've been doing it for 50 years. Now we just have to do it very differently. And it's such a challenge. We are working on the diverse revenue streams. One of the things we're doing, and I'll end with this, with our data journalists. So we have a data unit. We have a very small data unit, two and a half people. And so one of the ways that we're generating revenue is actually, they're doing consulting. So they're working on projects. They support the newsroom, but then they also have projects that bring in actually, pretty lucrative consulting projects where we do some data work, where we're building databases, or we're taking data and mapping it. And we're adding that to the advertising, the donors and membership models that we're developing, and the philanthropy to support it.
I want to make sure that we touch on a couple of questions that have been coming in the Q&A, but obviously this is a rich discussion. We could go in a lot of directions. Chelsea is asking us a question that I think is a really relevant one, which is so much of the strength of what all of you are building and have built relates to turning the model to really ask your audience what it is that is worthy of pursuit, and then building that system on top of that. But Chelsea asks, what about the things that we know to be of interest, but that don't come up in a survey or aren't reported on as being of immediate? How do you balance the things that people don't know that they might want to know about? And I don't know, maybe jump ball, but Jessica, maybe, or Margaret, let me throw it to you.
Yeah. So, we have, we've started at launch. We started with very clear directives in terms of our actual funding models, in terms of what topics we're going to report on full time. But in 2020, of course, all of those best laid plans went awry. But what the lens at which we're looking at stories is not a national one, it is a hyper local one. So although former President Trump's first lawsuit in Georgia was actually here in our county, in Chatham County. We covered that because it was breaking news and it was something of statewide interest, and our content is free to republish. So that turned into a really interesting branding exercise for us, because people from around the state were sort of tuning in to our local coverage at our local courthouse for a very big story. But we decided very early on, we're not going to cover things from a national lens. It's going to be local. And so when we're talking about disinformation, we're talking about, the spread of anti-Semitic and racist campaign literature and communication models. We had a local DA's race here that we were the current was the only one covering this, and it could take national themes and bring them very locally. So we were thinking in a sophisticated way about how to get people to realize that those national themes actually affect us locally. And our coverage that sort of revealed this very, as I said, murky funding model that our former incumbent DA had in terms of putting this very hateful messaging out to the public. Because we uncovered that, the public opinion shifted against her, and she lost her race and her challenger won. And so these are ways in which we can build trust across a lot of different communities. Savannah, basically, when they read our story, realized that that's not the community they want to be. They don't want to be behind someone who is furthering this hateful and downright discriminatory messaging on a campaign. And they took action at the polls. And so there's a really direct line when communities trust local journalists and see that local journalists are the ones providing information rather than national media who don't know our communities very well.
One takeaway also from a different set of questions around business model that I think you all are showing is that success begins with actually finding the audience and engaging with that audience. It doesn't really begin with whether your legal structure is a not-for-profit or a for-profit, or kind of what your tax status is. And that can change over time. But I guess relating it to the previous question, do you think, with the benefit of where you are now, that the business model here that goes along with that local audience is likely to come locally, even if it's from local philanthropists as opposed to national philanthropy or local sponsors? Or do you think that there is some possibility of a national effort to drive and tie some of these things together? And Madeleine, I know you've thought a lot about this. I know, Paulette, you've thought about it. Everybody's thought about it. But Madeleine, maybe I can throw it over to you. Does the business model have to be equally local as the audience?
I don't know if I have an exact answer to that question, Craig, but I would say that I think one of my biggest learnings in developing and working to grow and fundraise to grow El Tímpano is that the existing business models for local news, whether those are for-profit or nonprofit organizations, they were designed for and by news outlets that serve traditional news outlet audiences, meaning primarily affluent audiences who can afford subscriptions, who can afford memberships, who can afford to make large individual gifts. El Tímpano is designed to serve a very different audience. And so we've had to be very creative to find business models that work for us, which is not necessarily a membership. And so, one of the business, our actually fastest growing revenue stream is partnerships with civic agencies and other nonprofit service providers that value the relationship that El Tímpano has with our audience, with community members who are often described as hard to reach. El Tímpano is effectively reaching those audiences. And so we can, work with these partners to connect them with those community members with the sort of information and services that they seek. And so, that's one of the business models that we've developed, that we're growing, and it's very much a local business model that's built with the foundation of the very local relationships that we've made, not only with our audience, but with other community organizations and agencies.
So Jessica, I'm coming to you with that question in a second, so just be ready for it. But before we get off of this, Madeleine, you mentioned civic agencies, and this ties to a question that Helen's just asked, which is sort of for Margaret, which is kind of a national local question. Georgia is a bellwether state, money flooding in to affect the outcome of an important Senate campaign and a big governor campaign. But Madeleine, also knowing that civic agencies may actually get government tax incentives to put money with local providers. Talk about that a little bit. And how do you remain steadfastly independent at the same time as the role of either outsiders, in the case of Georgia, may become more important, or in the case of here in California, local agencies become a funding source? So kind of jump ball, maybe Madeleine, stay with you, but then over to Margaret.
Sure. To just give you a sense of what these civic partnerships look like, El Tímpano received a large grant from our local public health department. A lot of us, we know that, and research shows that journalism is good for public health. When people are well informed about health issues, when they have a source they can trust to make healthy decisions, that supports healthy communities, and journalism can also act as a censor for emerging public health issues. And so in our case, local public health officials actually saw that. They saw the impact that El Tímpano is making in providing community members, primarily community members that have been among the most impacted by COVID, with a trusted source for information to make decisions for their health and well-being. And so we've received a grant from the public health department to support us to do the work that we have been doing anyways, to provide that sort of public health information and trusted source of information. With the public health department and with any of our partners, we are very clear and just transparent, as all news organizations are and must be when receiving funding, that we are also an independent journalism organization, and this sort of funding will not impact our reporting on public health issues, including our reporting that involves the county, and we have done reporting that directly involves the county's public health department. And so just as we would take money from an individual donor or any source of funding, we're very transparent with those sources of funding and with our audience about receiving those funds, and the lines that we won't cross in terms of providing trustworthy information.
And Madeleine, don't take this the wrong way. It's certainly not directed at El Tímpano, but in the Goldsmith Awards that Nancy just announced this week, among the winners were various different public health stories, including an investigative series by the folks at the Wichita Eagle on lack of response at the 911 service in Wichita that led to the departure of the 911 head. And so you could easily imagine how at some point these can become tougher issues. But I think the takeaway is transparency from the get-go. And so I think that's a great point. Margaret, let me throw it to you, just a quick answer on that question that Helen asked about national influence in local important elections. And then Jessica, I'm coming to you.
Hi, sorry, I'm having tech troubles.
No, we hear you.
Thanks, great. I should say, if I didn't previously, that the Current is a nonpartisan nonprofit news organization. And so we would never say no to a individual donor, no matter where you're geographically located, but we're not actively seeking funds from people who aren't in Georgia, if that makes sense. We have, in terms of our revenue modeling right now, we have about 50% of our revenue streams are coming from national foundations who are already in the space of funding local nonprofit journalism. It is a real, it's a real learning curve for local philanthropic organizations in coastal Georgia and across the state to get into this space, and making that direct link between people who are already giving money for good causes, linking how important local journalism is to the impact of their programming. And that's something that we've been working on in conjunction with a lot of different news organizations in Georgia. So for now, I'll say that, of our major donors, all except one are physically in Georgia, and our individual sustaining donors, probably close to 75% of our sustainers are also physically in Georgia.
Well, and also a pitch for a little research that we've been doing, actually not so little at Shorenstein, on these presence of pink slime sites, none of you guys, of course, but politically motivated sites that purport to be independent local journalism from both the left and the right that have kind of flooded the zone. Some of that money is going to create these sites, which in California anyway, had a big impact on Michael Tubbs, the Stockton mayor, not getting reelected recently. We've done a bit of work around that. Jessica, where I'm coming to you, and thanks for that, for everybody's input, I'm coming to you on the business model around video, and particularly, and you and I have talked about this a little bit, so I don't want to get too far ahead of my skis, but you have some providers, some platforms creating a fund of money for creators and then dividing it up based on some complex math about the engagement of those creators. There's one, I won't name them, but they do it that way. Others are splitting ad revenue. And that also is an important, the algorithms will decide also how content gets surfaced. Where do you see this going in your world? Because you're so much on the cutting edge of what's happening as people develop a direct broadcast relationship with their news provider, in this case, Jessica Yellen.
Thank you for the opportunity to say this. I think we're facing an existential crisis if we in any way trust these social media platforms to be a distribution source for fact-based information going forward, full stop. You do hear about creator funds supporting creators. In the Meta and Instagram universe, they go to girls selling belly button rings and bikinis and absolute mind-numbing nothingness. If you provide facts, they will not pay for it on the platform. They not only do that, they shadow ban your account, they suppress your content, and they make it nearly impossible or very difficult for you to reach your audience. And then they gaslight you and deny it's happening. I am saying that publicly and forcefully because it is horrific, and it is shocking to me that they are doing this at a time where they're being publicly criticized for having bad priorities. But at least in those two environments, I don't trust those platforms to help us get news information out. And that has changed in the time that I've been there. And I will be very transparent myself. I have a deal with one of them for my newsletter. And they've been very supportive in that space. But when you're talking about getting video through their platform channels, they're trying to avoid controversy. So I'm not depressed. I'm not negative. I think it's just an opportunity for us to invest in and grow alternative channels. And I also think, to just be brief, there's interest in that, and people are starting, funders, investors, concerned citizens are aware and starting to care and think about this.
Yeah, and if you didn't hear Jessica on whatever that thing that Jon Stewart and Kara did a week or so ago, what's that thing called? I forget what it's called.
Twitter Spaces, yeah.
Yeah, there's an interesting program there, and you and Soledad were very articulate around these challenges. And actually, I promised we wouldn't run over. Of course, we've run over. Rap on the knuckles, Jessica. Everybody needs a producer, but I think it was worthwhile because we not only, I think, and I hope everyone feels this, we sketched out some of the real reasons for success, hearing from your audience, connecting, engaging with that audience, turning the model upside down, but then building from, if it's not relevant and it's not essential, there won't be an audience. But then realizing that as much as this represents some of the best that there is, and it really does, these challenges continue to proliferate. And what Jessica just ended on is just one of many challenges. I really want to thank our panel. Thank you so much for spending the time. I want to thank our audience. I want to answer Tom's question. And if it's the same Tom I'm thinking of, he's the former tax correspondent of the Wall Street Journal, knows a lot more about tax than anybody else on this call, but I don't think we've heard that any 501c3s have been rejected, Tom, by the IRS in this space because their applications were deficient. I don't think that's an issue. And you know how to reach me if you want to follow up with that. And I want to thank everybody who joined us really from around the world. It's been a very engaged group led by our panelists. And tune in next week where we have on Tuesday at noon Eastern, another very interesting panel in this series on innovation and digital news. So Thank you all so much, and everybody have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.